Wisconsin's 1,924 local governments spent $16.8 billion in 2013. Thanks to the Fiscal Bureau, here are the numbers. There are 190 cities, 72 counties, 407 villages, and 1,255 towns. All of them provide services that touch every Wisconsin resident. To talk about the importance of the 2015-2016 legislative session to those local governments, thanks to my left, Jerry Duchesne, Executive Director of the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, Mike Colas, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Towns Association, Mark O'Connell, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Counties Association. Gentlemen, I'm going to start with an overview question. I'd like each of you to answer it. How critical is the next legislative session to the local governments you represent? And Jerry, why don't you start? And as a benchmark, there are 190 cities. They spent $7.38 billion in 2013. There's 407 villages. They spent $1.5 billion. So importance of the next session.
Critical, especially transportation. That's probably, if the legislature can get nothing else done and done right, a long-term solution to the transportation budget is essential.
That's
we've been making the rounds of the halls of the Capitol, and they've all got the talking point down. We have no money, so we get that. But long-term funding of transportation, because it's a local issue, is huge.
So that's issue one for
that's absolutely
for
issue
your
one.
munis. Mike, your towns, your 1,255 towns spent $837 million in 2013. Biggest priority for your towns?
Jerry stole my answer.
Oh, he did?
Critical is the moniker he put on it, and I would say it's critical as well. Transportation is our number one issue. I think there are a couple of watershed moments that we're embarking on. One of them is transportation. Are we going to fund transportation in a long-term, equitable, sustainable manner? That is our number one concern. And then I think the local control issue is going to come up as well. And for us, we believe strongly in local control, and I'm looking forward to having that discussion.
Thank you. Mark, your 72 counties spent $7.1 billion in calendar 2013. Your top priority, sir?
Top priority is transportation.
Yes,
in response to your question, Steve, how critical is the session? Extremely critical. The demographics of our state are changing dramatically. We're getting old really quick. When we get older in life, we consume more government services that are provided by the state, authorized by the state, but then delivered by counties, towns, and cities. Those don't go down in price, and so the challenge we're going to be facing is stagnant or barely increasing revenues, greater demand and need, and an absolute necessity to look further out into the future. Rather than try to solve our problems 1 or 2 years at a time, we need to start solving problems in 10, 20, 50-year increments. Transportation is a great example. We can't just solve the problem for this session. We need to solve this problem, and as Mike put it, in a sustainable revenue way for 10, 15, 20, 50 years into the future. And that's one of the biggest challenges I think we face as a state.
I want to elaborate on something you each identified. In the coming yin and yang push and pull for state general fund dollars, K-12, healthcare, the Department of Health Services alone wants $760 million more to care for MA caseloads, and transportation for state projects, not your local projects. Where do your local governments, 1,924 of them, rank in this? I almost said food fight, but it's that demeans it. This critical dialogue for state general fund dollars.
Well, I think it's a good question, and if we assume that the basket of revenues stays the same, then we're trying to jockey about for who's ahead of who. I don't really think that's the question we ought to be looking at. In our state, our tax mix is off. Local units of government rely on the property tax, which is a dying revenue source, and absolutely, without question, is not sustainable as the number one revenue source for local governments in the future. So given that, we need to examine how we raise revenues and then also how we expend them. Tax mix has to be changed, and then we have a legitimate and intelligent conversation about expenditures.
Well, and you mentioned the property tax, and the Clayfish and Chandler report came out last week, and they said after their 23 roundtables, property tax is the most hated even though we're all making out our property tax bills probably as we speak. So the property tax, let's come back to that, but I want to give you a chance to, in the competition for dollars, do you feel like your local governments are up against the UW system, the prison system?
Well, the way the state is currently set up, our tax structure that Mark talked about, absolutely. The state took away a lot of revenue options over the last 150 years, a lot of local revenue options, and replaced it with things like the shared revenue program. Well, now that you have the one big program, it's competing with all of the other one big programs. Should local governments be a part of that conversation? They have to be. State of Wisconsin owns 0 snowplows, none. Local government plows every road out there. 10 out of 11 local road or 10 out of 11 road miles is a local road. Local governments do a lot of the lifting in Wisconsin, and since the state legislature sets the boundaries on where and how we can raise revenue, we have to be part of that conversation.
Your thought, Mike?
I think it's a great question. If we're going to continue to have a zero-sum game, we're going to be in trouble. And the question is a lot like asking, in my mind, would you, as a runner, I'm a jogger, would you rather have your heart functioning properly or your capillaries? There's not an option. Okay? We have to have them all functioning properly if we're going to grow our economy and grow our communities and be the state that we want to be. So we need to look at the problem not as a zero-sum game anymore, but very differently than we have in the past.
Let's talk about your consumers and your customers in local governments. They understand the local government services, the emergency services, the police, the sheriff, the fire, and snow plowing and removal of my garbage. But do they have a trouble understanding, is there a disconnect between local government services provided by your members and the decisions made in the Capitol? Do they understand who makes what decisions, and funding decisions with revenue sharing greatly affect the services that your local governments can provide?
Intellectually, a lot of them do, but in reality, no. Most people, they've got their own lives to lead. They don't think about, well, the state legislature establishes the levy and there's the expenditure restraint program and then we get these. They don't have time for all of that. Like you, they get their property tax bill in December, and if it's flat, they're happy, and if it's up, they're not happy, and that's about as far as they take it.
Okay. Okay.
I think at the local level, I mean, there's an understanding about how things work. I'm not saying there's agreement on how things ought to work, but there's an understanding. And this is not new ground we're plowing here. Years ago, we had the Leanne Commission, or report, where we essentially concluded that property-based activities ought to be paid for with the property tax, and human-based activities ought to be paid for with state revenues, income and sales. It's not new. We've all known for a long time, and I think our legislature, while this is the most inexperienced legislature we've had in a long time, right, but they're very smart. This legislature is full of a lot of very bright people with big ideas. I'm really very optimistic that we're going to have some creatively intelligent conversations about what might be. Now, for those of us that have been around quite some time, some of these new and creative ideas are ideas that we've heard 30 years ago, yeah, but they're new to our current policymakers. But I'm anxious to have those conversations, because the status quo and how we're doing things, it's not sustainable long term.
Are you seeing more or less local officials being elected to the Assembly and the Senate?
It's certainly not any less.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're still the training ground, mm-hmm, in large part for the legislature.
Okay. I want to talk about specific programs, mm-hmm, specific lifelines that the next state budget will throw. Let's talk about revenue sharing. According to the Fiscal Bureau, it scores out at about $905 million a year. My question is, has that not been increased in recent years?
I don't think it's been increased in 10, 15, 20 years. When was the last time
Not
you saw
substantially.
No substantial increase in quite some time.
That's causing pressure. You take into consideration inflation. And a lot of our services that we provide don't track with CPI. The costs are much, much greater from an inflationary standpoint. You take flat shared revenue, and that becomes problematic for us. Like Mark said, demands are going up, costs are going up on those increased demands, and revenue is flat at best.
And it's understandable because with shared revenue, we're asking policymakers to increase dollars to shared revenue raised but shared with local units of government that go to a whole host of things. And it's a very legitimate question for the legislature to say, well, exactly what do you spend that on? That's a fair question. Mm-hmm. And when it's rather nebulous to support the kinds of functions that we perform at the local level in support of state-created programs and services, that it gets murky. And so there isn't a big following, or there isn't a lot of impetus to increase dollars in that area. Now you talk about a specific area, let's say transportation. Can you give us dollars for transportation so we can carry out the state's desires? Well, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can walk on it. There's much more willingness to put dollars in that area. So that's one of the reasons that we haven't seen much of an increase in shared revenue for quite some time.
If all three of you listed transportation as your top priority, if they address in a sustainable way, Mike, your term, transportation funding, would you be happy then with continuing to hold revenue sharing flat at $905 million a year if you got transportation help?
Well,
or do you not want to bargain on Wisconsin Eye show?
Well, this goes back to Mike's comment about, so you're offering to fix my heart but not touch the capillaries. We have to provide police and fire, all the other essential services that our citizens want. And to say you fixed 1/4 of that and not the rest, long term, that's not a good solution. Short term, and one of the things we're advocating for is let's start taking a longer look at how we fund local government. Right now, we've set up a system that forces Mike's members and my members to compete for land, annexation. It's all tied to the property tax, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, I guess.
We'll go deep in the property tax.
But if you want to make local government more efficient, get us away from that one albatross.
Okay.
Tomorrow I'm having a discussion in my office about public safety. And what we see some of our members doing, because public safety costs have, and some of Jerry's members are going to be there as well, what we're seeing in the towns is because public safety costs have gone up exponentially in some cases, that they're actually taking money from their transportation budget and shifting it to public safety. So again, it's an interesting question, but can we address only one and not the other of some of our primary services? And I think the answer is no.
Okay.
We've got revenue growth of 2.7 and 4.1 projected. Roughly, give or take, 1.2, 1.3 billion. Medicaid is going to get funded at 700 plus
760.
Million. It's going to get funded.
That's just the MA caseload.
We are going to do something in transportation, and part of it is going to be in general purpose revenues. So that's another anywhere from $200 to $700 million. So just those two, there aren't any dollars. We can't even keep the lights on in corrections, which is estimated at $40 million. So are we expect, the political fiscal reality is if would we desire increase in shared revenue? Yes, we would desire that. Is it likely to happen? It is not likely to happen. That's political fiscal reality.
And the Regents wants $95 million more to absorb the tuition freeze.
Oh, and we haven't even talked about UW and K-12.
Right.
And those are two major areas. So.
But now let's go into transportation. I was so intrigued at your press conference last week. All three of you gentlemen endorsed the Transportation Secretary's proposal. That's no minor lift that he wants. $751 million in higher taxes and fees, and let me get the number right, of $574 million in general fund aid. So you all three endorsed that, but you all three also covered the waterfront, my term, with potential other sources of revenue, including a personal property tax on vehicles, including a local gas tax, including a potential local sales tax on gasoline. Why did you throw so many Hail Mary passes on transportation, guys?
I don't think they're Hail Mary.
All right.
Because if we're going to fund transportation, it is going to be across several diversified revenue streams. And that's in essence, in large part, what Secretary Gottlieb put forward. We can talk big numbers of multiple millions of this issue and that issue. Let's keep in mind, Secretary Gottlieb's proposal would cost the average Wisconsin driver $28 a year. $28 a year to move product from point A to point B, to get our children from their home to their school safely, to take care of our city, town, village, and county roads and sustain them, state highways, $28 a year.
Can I parse that, Mark?
Sure.
Are you assuming that nobody goes out and buy a new vehicle because he wants a surtax on new vehicles?
Sure.
And are you assuming that I'm not registering a hybrid car? Because does that 28 cover just somebody driving one sedan and not buying a new vehicle, and it's not electric?
I think we'd have to ask the Secretary to, I mean, on each individual situation, some people it's going to cost $0, and some people it is going to cost $150. But on average, as the Secretary put it, $28 a year. And no one likes increased taxes. No one. I haven't met anyone who says, please increase my taxes. So I'm not surprised at all when we hear people or polls that say 50, 60, 70% don't like the increased revenues in the transportation package. I'm not surprised at all. If I were to ask the citizens, would you like to pay more for juvenile corrections? Can I increase your taxes for juvenile corrections? I would be a little shocked if I didn't, if I got more than 10% saying yes. But so no one likes that, but it is necessary.
Are we going to see resolutions passed by your local governments endorsing the transportation, the proposed transportation budget?
We'll be carrying the message to the Capitol that our members support it, but resolutions, we're not planning to do that right now.
No.
To get to your earlier question, Steve, the list, I don't think they're a list of Hail Marys. I think we're about to embark on a discussion that is going to involve a lot of divergence, necessary divergence, where we're going to disagree and we're going to argue and we're going to put things through the sausage maker. And then I believe that our state lawmakers will come together and converge, like we have converged, on a workable solution that includes multiple potential tools to raise revenue. What we need to do is raise revenue. And if it's a personal property tax, if it's a wheel tax, if it's what the Secretary has proposed, I think the big message is that we've got to raise that revenue.
Staying with transportation, do you look for whatever compromise passes on transportation funding? Because I'm going to say I don't think we're going to bond again another $991 million over 2 years.
Good.
Well, it's good from a taxpayer standpoint because now 16% of all transportation revenues are paying off debt service.
Yep.
But here's my question. Do you think both Democrats and Republicans will come together and vote for a compromise transportation budget that will not only help state transportation programs, but your locals?
I do.
You guys have 107,000 streets and roads. That's a big number.
Yep. And yes, I do.
You look for a bipartisan?
I think there will be a bipartisan compromise because what the Secretary did that was so right was he addressed the entire network, the entire system, roads, bridges, bus systems, you name it. And that's the only way. You look at states where they've solved this revenue problem, and that's the only way you can do it, is you address the whole system. You don't just say, hey, we're going to take care of our interstate system. Everything after the on-ramp is up to you guys. I believe that there is the will. I don't know what the package looks like, and there will be much wailing and grinding of teeth over details of the package. And that was partly the point of our study last week, our press conference. Put a few more ideas on the table because our members want to be responsible for this as well. It's not just Governor Walker's problem or the legislature's problem. It's local government's problem as well.
Mark,
I think they'll solve it.
Mark, you and I remember 1995 when the transportation budget passed separately, and it passed in the fall.
Yes.
Do you expect both Ds and Rs to vote for whatever passes?
I would say if we had a transportation package put forward on its own, I would expect widespread bipartisan support. If the transportation package is part of the overall state budget, which I think is the most likely scenario, then I think we're going to see a lot of support for that element. But when it comes time for the final package, we'll probably vote how we usually vote. It will pass the legislature, but it'll be along partisan lines.
Mike, your town spent $837 million in calendar 2013. What percentage of that was on local roads?
You know, I would not know a percentage right off the top of my head, but our primary
chunk?
Yeah, absolutely. Our primary responsibility is roads in towns. Secondary to that is going to be public safety.
That's what I thought. Yeah. Okay. Moving on to a different subject. Mark, let's talk about state aid, community aids, juvenile correction aids. Talk about Talk about that as a costly, I assume it's a lot more costly item for your counties?
It is. This is one of those issues that when it comes to human services, and quite frankly a lot of what counties do, if you never have to interact with counties in our corrections area or human services area, what that means is that your life is probably okay. But if you do, you're glad that it's there. And quite frankly, even if you don't interact with it, you're glad somebody is taking care of that. These issues are not the page 1 issues. Quite frankly, now they're not even the page 38 issues, if there even is a page 38 anymore in the newspapers. It's the fabric that maintains society. It keeps it together so it's a reasonable and pleasant place to be. Juvenile corrections, community aids, human services, great programs that the state has established because they saw a need in our society, and asked the counties to carry it out. We don't have sufficient revenue to do it, so we asked the property taxpayers to supplement. And now we're asking the property taxpayers for a cap on what it is to supplement what the state provides. It's a major problem.
Give us 2 or 3 examples of specific programs that are financed by this ambiguous term, community aids. Foster care?
Foster care is one of them.
What else?
It's a great foster care is probably a perfect one. The allocations provided to our foster care parents for clothing, for example, it's almost embarrassing because you can't care for kids, and you can't clothe and put shoes on a child for $100 a year. But we get some dollars from the state, but we put many more property tax dollars into that particular program.
Okay, that's one example.
It's a great example, and people can understand that. And those foster care kids, if cared for well, and generally there's some trouble in their home life, that's why they're foster care kids, but if cared for well, we can create an opportunity where they can be a contributing member of society. But if we don't do it right, those foster care kids in many cases graduate to juvenile corrections stature, and then after that our state prison system, and that's not where we want those children.
Okay, new subject. Are you seeing more preemption of local government authority? And I want to offer 2 examples. Senator Tiffany, as you're well aware, wants a statewide bill setting standards for frac sand mines. Example number 1. Representative Joel Kleefisch, it was in the news yesterday, wants statewide standards for where sex offenders can live. Are you seeing more preemption of what had been local government authorities by state government, by the Capitol?
Mm-hmm. Is it more? I don't know if it's historically more, but it's a constant challenge. It seems like every time something happens at the local level that someone doesn't like, their solution is go to the legislature and stop that statewide. I'm not enough of a historical scholar to know if it's more, but we see it every year.
Mike, your town roads are getting eroded by these heavy frac sand trucks. They're getting destroyed. What's emerging as the town's position on the potential Tiffany bill?
On the Tiffany bill, well, there were a couple of Tiffany bills last session,
right?
And we were against both of those versions of the bill. We're very much for local control. To your question, I think that maybe it's not more, but it's more pointed. Everybody hates Madison and Washington messing in their lives until the local government makes a rule that they don't like, and then they want Madison and Washington to step in. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't have a responsive town, city, village, county government that you can call up and very easily unelect in an April election, and then come back the next week and say, well, we don't like these shysters at the local level because they did something that we didn't like. And what I think we're seeing now is some of those interests trying to go to that, quite frankly, historically may not have liked Madison or Washington, going to Madison or Washington trying to preempt local control. With regard to frac sand mining, we think that our local governments ought to have the ability to manage our roads, as you pointed out. Our roads are under constant pressure from all kinds of heavy vehicles, and the ability to draw up a road use agreement to make sure that those roads are repaired once they are broken up, absolutely critical. Noise, air, dust, water. If somebody's well goes dry, we think the local government ought to be able to tell the mining company that they need to replace that well. So absolutely we believe in local control. and are going to make sure that we are at the table to have that discussion when it occurs.
I want to give Mark a chance to answer, but I have a follow-up for you.
Sure.
Your local villages and cities in western Wisconsin that are affected by frac sands. Your position on the potential Tiffany bill?
It depends on the substance of the bill. In general, frac sand mines are not an issue for an incorporated community. There have been a couple of exceptions to that. But in general, we're in the same place that Mike's people are.
Okay. Now, Mark, over the couple of years you've been doing this, are you seeing more preemption of what had been county authority by the Capitol?
Well, I think there's different words for it. I guess preemption might be one word, but there's also, from the other side's perspective, it would be a reliability or consistency across political boundaries. For example, should we, on one end of the spectrum, would be locals, you can decide everything within your boundary. If you decide you don't want any cell towers or any frac sand mining or any large livestock operations, you can decide that you're not going to have it there. On the other end of the spectrum is locals, you have nothing to say about it. The state will decide that where it will be and how it will work. And now, is either extreme good? No, not really. That's why we have local government. There are local needs and concerns. Have we gone too far? I think you have to look at each individual, I guess, function. Frac sand mining is a good one. I don't want to put words in Senator Tiffany's mouth, but what he has indicated, what I've heard, is that he wants a going concern to continue to be able to operate within reason. And the vast majority of frac sand mining companies are incredibly responsible. We have a few entities that are not operating properly, and we've got a few local units of government that some would say are not acting responsibly. But we can't make legislation based on the extremes. There is a middle ground. I believe Senator Tiffany wants to find that middle ground, and we're very willing to talk with him about what that is. I would not look for a statewide preemption. I don't think that's what he desires. At least it's not my interpretation, but it's going to be an element of the conversation.
Okay, now let's talk about property taxes. A priority of Governor Walker has been controlling property tax bills on homes. That has been achieved, and I don't have to tell you this, by levy limits on your local governments. Have those levy limits significantly crimped the local services, and if those levy limits remain in place, because that's what the governor says they're going to stay in place to control property taxes, tell me about the future of local government services with continuing levy limits, assuming no major new source of revenue. What's it look like?
Well, the math on that is very simple. Our ability to plow streets and provide police, fire protection, and parks, and all of the other amenities that communities want will get gradually smaller and smaller and smaller. If all the assumptions in your statement are correct, it's inevitable, because costs go up, the cost of pavement, the cost of gas will go back up again. I mean, all of our costs, the cost of insurance for those employees that plow the streets, I think everyone knows that you can't simply say don't spend more money, and that's the only solution year after year after year. We're going to put forth a proposal for something that eventually will replace shared revenue, a regional economic development incentive program, and it'll take away this incentive for us to fight community to community. But eventually you have to provide local governments either with flexibility under levy limits or with a new system. And I think Mark touched on this earlier. Wisconsin's been chasing the property tax for 180 years. My personal opinion is the governor hasn't gone far enough. He should say we need to get rid of it over the next 30 years. And then figure out how you replace it.
Are you going to offer this regional approach in the next session?
Yes.
Right? You are?
Yes. We've talked about it before among all our organizations. It would be a new formula that rewards regions, not cities, not villages, not towns, not counties, regions for their growth. And that's what a growing payment would be based on.
Are the leaders in that capital aware that this is coming from you leaders of local governments?
Yes.
They are.
It's been introduced in the past. It's never gone anywhere. But as time goes by, the issue becomes more critical.
Okay. The property tax.
Well, the property tax, we have, we're high on property taxes in this state compared to the rest of the country. And I would say, from my perspective, I find it rather annoying sometimes that we talk about either top 10 or bottom 10, and we're not in the middle. In Wisconsin, we are about 2% of everything in this country, but I'm not so sure that being average in any particular area is what we ought to strive for. I mean, I'd like to be the best in everything in this state, and we are in many cases. But in terms of the property tax, we have this challenge where we have high property taxes, and to address it, we've said, all right, we have high property taxes, I guess we'll cap the levy. There, that's solved. Well, it isn't solved, because we need to dig a lot deeper. And here's the 1-minute version of digging a little bit deeper. For a long time, we looked at property and we measured a person's wealth by how much property they acquired. Mm-hmm. They would buy additional property, maybe improve the property, be higher value property, and we valued their wealth based on, or we measured them, their wealth by how much property or the quality of the property that they acquired. Right. And we charged them a dollar amount called the property tax that they then paid. And for a long time it worked well, because the individual had this underlying revenue stream called wages or income, which allowed them to acquire the property and allowed them to pay the property tax based on their perceived wealth. Well, a couple of years ago, something happened. The first baby boomer retired. So they are losing the underlying revenue stream called income, wages, but we're still measuring their wealth based on how much property they've acquired. So very soon, as the 78 million baby boomers retire, very soon they're going to be in a position where we really will be property taxing people out of their homes. That is why I say, long term, given demographics, the property tax is not sustainable as a long-term revenue stream for local units of government. And that leads into our property tax mix being off. We're high on property tax, we're high on income, we are low on sales, and we're very low on fees and other charges.
You mentioned sales. Most counties have a local option sales tax. Does what they're allowed to charge with a local option sales tax, does that need to be increased, Mark?
Well, I think we need to re-examine our entire mix. Okay. We're at 5% as a state. We ought to have a serious conversation about the mix. The trouble is this. We have talked ourselves into not being able to have a conversation. That seems rather strange. But when we talk ourselves into it, here's what I mean. No new taxes anytime, anywhere, for any reason. Well, okay, that's a fine position. But if we're going to talk about changing our mix, not everything's going to go down. Vehicle registration fees are going to go up. Sales tax might go up. Income taxes might go down. Corporate income tax might be eliminated. I'm not sure. But we have to have that conversation. That requires an open mind. And we really need to have that in this state if we want to have a chance of laying the brickwork for a more successful future.
Okay, time's getting away. I only have a couple more questions. One of them, 4 years later almost, the impact of Act 10 on local governments. Major? Significant? Jerry, you want to go first?
Major. We are still, a lot of our local governments are working through replacing procedures that used to be done by contract that now have to be done by an employee manual. It had generally, it was a helpful thing financially. It caused an awful lot of angst. It caused an awful lot of retirements. We're through most of that, but now we're seeing putting in place procedures that used to be defined by contract. But yeah, it absolutely was one of the most major changes that local government saw in decades.
Mike, with the towns?
You know, it affects Mark and Jerry more than it does us by virtue of number of employees, directly, indirectly, because those pressures that were causing prices to go up for labor, et cetera, that have stabilized those in the cities and villages and counties, that indirectly impacts us.
Okay. Mark?
Major and significant, and I am very proud to say that I think almost all of the employers, certainly the counties, have taken that newfound power and used it in an incredibly responsible way. And that has really been, I think, part of the secret to its success.
Okay, this has been an excellent show. My final question is this. If you had a chance in the next 2 weeks to talk to the governor one-on-one about his 2015-2017 budget, you're just meeting one-on-one with the governor, not the three of you, what would you ask? Mark, you want to go first?
Sure. I would ask the governor to solve the problems of 2025, which starts now. That is, we need to look at what the world looks like in 2025, and if we like it, then we're on the right course. But if we don't like what we see in 2025, some of those solutions start right now. And a real life example, transportation.
Okay.
It's an investment in our future.
Mike?
The best decisions are made by those closest to the challenges at the local level. And we have some opportunities to have wise local decisions made at the local level. And as we started off, I would say transportation is high on that list. And the local level has the opportunity to partner with our state level partners to make some very wise decisions to fund both the heart and the capillaries if we get that revenue.
Jerry?
I would tell him that Mike and Mark are brilliant and he should believe everything they told him. But then I would also say let's start the conversation for 25 years from now by talking about a regional economic development formula.
Excellent.
I guess the last thing we would say, if we were jointly talking to him, Governor, watch Wisconsin Eye, because in the content of Wisconsin Eye, all of the answers are there. They're all there.
You know, I'm really curious. Can you talk about your regional funding source just quickly? I mean, just what you said it's been around before, but let's talk about it.
Well, and it's not a funding source per se. It's how you take what had been shared revenue, hold everybody harmless, because that's how you do it these days.
Yes.
But as Wisconsin's economy grows, not as property value grows, as the economy grows, as jobs and income grow in a defined regional area, the counties, the towns, and the cities would get a bump according to that formula. We move away from measuring it by property and move toward measuring it by economic growth, which is what we're all after.
Measured on a regional way?
Measured in a regional basis, because that's how our economy works.
Well, we could do another 30 minutes, but the regional disparities, I mean, you've seen the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, and 30% of working age people are going to be gone from Bayfield and Price counties, but that's a topic maybe for another day.
I was about to say, I think maybe 2 programs on that one.
Hey, that's a good idea. I want to thank Mark O'Connell of the Wisconsin Counties Association and Mike Colas of the Wisconsin Towns and Jerry Duchesne of the League of Wisconsin Municipalities for previewing their issues in the next legislative session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Steve.
Thank you.